Hello, boys and girls. You're all very welcome to our Zoom talk with the one and only award-winning author and journalist, Michael Foley. Michael, thank you so much for giving up your time this evening. We're so looking forward to chatting to you. And I know there's so many fifth and sixth class students around Dublin at the minute, finishing up their project and looking to get an insight into Bloody Sunday.
Thanks, Leona. And yeah, best of luck to everybody now with their projects. Like from what I hear, there's a lot of people doing a lot of hard work and looking into it. And thanks so much for taking an interest in Bloody Sunday and in all the people who passed away at that time and kind of trying to tell their story in a different way. Um, so I'm just going to give you a really short version of Bloody Sunday that might just kind of jog your memories or give you a couple of ideas for your projects and so on. So basically, in Dublin in 1920, the War of Independence had been on nearly 2 years. And down the country in places like Tipperary and that, it was a different kind of war. It was a lot of combat. The IRA and the police were battling a lot. There was a lot of fights at RIC barracks and so on and so forth, and ambushes. Whereas in Dublin, it was slightly different. There was proper battles, but more so it was an intelligence war where you had a set of spies on the IRA side and a set of spies on the British side, and they were both trying to burrow into each other and find out where the various key targets were to try and get them. So by the time November 1920 comes around, the British intelligence are really getting close to the top men in the IRA, which would have included Michael Collins and people like that. So the IRA in a situation where they need to sort of let the British know that they still mean business and they wanted to strike back. So they decided to target across the city a load of spies or people that they thought were spies. So on Sunday morning, November 21st, 1920, IRA men went out to 35 different houses. When they got to the houses, there was actually only people in 8 of them. So they went to the houses, knocked on the doors, went up, found their targets, and they killed or mortally wounded 15 people. So that was how Bloody Sunday started. And then the IRA men just dispersed across the city. But one of them, for example, well, a very interesting guy when we talk about Croke Park in the afternoon and the match then was Johnny MacDonald, who was with one IRA group who went to a house on Upper Mount Street. And then he went back home, got changed because he was the Dublin goalkeeper. And he went up to Croke Park to play for Dublin that afternoon against Tipperary in a football challenge game. And it was a huge match because Dublin in 1920 were like Dublin now. They were favourites for an All Ireland and a big team. And Tipperary were actually a bit like Tipperary are now. They're going for an All Ireland as well, and they were considered a very, very strong team in 1920. So Dublin and Tip playing in a match was a big thing. So 15,000 people arrived, and like 15,000 people in Croke Park then would be like 80,000 people now, because Croke Park was a much smaller ground back in 1920. So 15,000 people was like basically like a full house. So it was so full, in fact, that the game was delayed for a full half hour to get everybody in properly. So in Dublin Castle, up on Dame Street, which was where the British government in Ireland were, that was their main kind of heartbeat of the whole operation. They were there and they were thinking, okay, what happened this morning? The Dublin brigade of the IRA, the Dublin section of the IRA, there's no way they could have actually pulled this off on their own. They needed help. So they reckoned people must have come up from the country, possibly disguised as football supporters. So they decided we're going to go to the game at Croke Park, we're going to stop it, and we're going to search every single person in there and see can we find anybody who had any connection to the morning's killings, or find something that might lead us to the people who did this. So a combined force of RIC, who were like the regular police at the time, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, who were 2 extra forces, mainly comprised of former soldiers who had been fighting in World War One, but had come home to Britain with no jobs. So they joined this extra force that were sent to Ireland to try and deal with the IRA. The RIC, the Black and Tans and auxiliaries, went to Croke Park. And if you know the geography of Croke Park, if any of you have been in Croke Park, there's a canal bridge just outside the ground, just near where the Hogan stand would be now, and you've got the Croke Park Hotel up just ahead of it. Well, the trucks came up there, and the first truck stopped right on top of that bridge, and they were all snaking all the way back up the road then towards the North Circular Road. The idea was that the soldiers would get down and they would get ready to perform a search, but instead, soldiers jumped out of the first 2 trucks. Some of them took positions on the bridge, and other ones ran down a little alley towards turnstiles, and they started firing on the crowd. Now, the first person that was hit was a boy. He was 11 years of age. His name was William Robinson. He came from Little Britain Street, which, if you're standing, you probably all know where Little Britain Street is anyway. But for someone like me from Cork, I always have to remind myself where it is. If you're standing in the middle of O'Connell Street by the Spire, Little Britain Street is like 5 minutes to your left, away over that way. It's not far at all. But he was sitting in a tree because he was 11 and he had the good sense to think, well, it's a huge crowd. I'm going to get the best seat in the house. So when he heard the trucks coming, he looked around and he was shot and he fell off the tree. Just down of the way a little bit from him was 10-year-old Jerome O'Leary. And Jerome had come up from the inner city as well. And he was sitting on a wall that used to run along the back of the goal that was by the canal. And he looked up and he was shot as well. And from then, the firing really started. So it was 90 seconds of shooting. 14 people were killed and mortally wounded, including a Tipperary player called Michael Hogan, who was from a place called Grange Mochler. And he was crawling along the field trying to get away with a couple of Dublin players when the shots hit him and he died on the field. There was one other boy killed. He was 14 years of age. He was John William Scott, and he went to school up in Drumcondra, and he actually lived on Fitzroy Avenue, which is just across the road from Croke Park. So he actually went to the game with a friend of his. So they would have just walked across the road and gone straight into the ground, and he was killed as well. So 14 people killed, 90 seconds, absolute chaos. It was just complete shock and trauma for everybody. So in the days afterwards then, when it came to the funerals, the guys in the morning were taken back to London and given huge funerals in Westminster Abbey. It was a really big occasion, whereas the people who died in Croke Park were given very quiet funerals. They were told not to have big crowds at them, to keep it very quiet. So a lot of them were buried in Glasnevin. There was one man, he was buried, James Burke was his name. He was buried in St. Nahi Cemetery out in Dundrum. It's really near the shopping centre out there. And then some of the others were buried down the country in Limerick and Tipperary and places like that. And that was the story then. Basically, there was 2 military inquiries afterwards that were kind of like courts, but basically they found that the firing had started inside the ground and that the police had responded. That's what the authorities said. But when we look at the evidence now, we can see that that wasn't true, that the firing actually started outside the ground. So those reports were done. They were sealed for nearly 80 years. It was 1999 before people could actually read those reports and see the evidence again. So for all the years after that, there wasn't a word about Bloody Sunday. And particularly for the victims in Croke Park, 8 of them were left in unmarked graves. So they didn't have a headstone. No one knew where they were. So about 5 years ago, I wrote a book called The Bloodied Field, which came out in 2014. And I realized at that point that there was 8 of them in unmarked graves. And then one of them, their family, her name was Jane Boyle. She was killed. She was 29. She was due to be married the following Thursday. And she was actually buried in her wedding dress. But her family decided in 2015 that they would put up a gravestone to her. So I got in touch with them. They got in touch with me. We all got in touch with the GAA. And that created something called the Bloody Sunday Graves Project. And from that, we managed to eventually get in touch with loads of families who had victims and relatives in unmarked graves. And to date, we've had 7 out of 8 of the graves now with gravestones on them. And it's been brilliant because it's meant we've learned so much more about those victims to add to what we had already learned about the original 14, or the other 6, I should say. So now we have a totally different picture of Bloody Sunday because we can learn from where these people came from, the kind of people they were, what happened in Croke Park and how it affected their families for years afterwards. And, you know, for people like you now in Dublin, there's so many connections. Obviously, you have the Dublin football team. And I was even just looking at the clubs that played that day or who had players playing. And like for now, let's say if you're in Ballymun-Kickham's, you had a player playing on Bloody Sunday. If you're in Parnell's, you had a player playing on Bloody Sunday. If you're anywhere near, or if you're playing for a team called Geraldine Mourns, you had a player playing on Bloody Sunday. O'Toole's GA Club had a huge number of players playing because they were really strong at the time. So they have a great tradition with Bloody Sunday. And there was even one player from Kildare who played for Dublin, and his team was UCD out in Stillorgan. So like there's all of those. And then even you look at where the victims came from. And you have Jane Boyle, who I mentioned. She was from Portobello, from Lennox Street. If anyone is from over that side of town, where the Bretzel Bakery is on the corner, she was just down that street. Gardner Place. Michael Foley was a British Army. He fought in World War One. He lived on Gardner Place, which is just near Mountjoy Square, near Barry's Hotel. Buckingham Street, Blessington Street in the inner city. That was Patrick O'Dowd and Jerome O'Leary. They would have come up from the middle of the city. Joseph Traynor was from Ballymount, which is out now near Clondalkin. North Cumberland Street, James Matthews. his daughter, his wife, they had two daughters, and his wife was expecting their third daughter, and he had no grave for years. And in 2016, when we put up a grave for James, or gravestone for James, his daughter was there to see the gravestone going up. Nancy Dillon was her name. James Burke is from Windy Arbor. I was mentioning there before, he's buried in Dundrum. And then you have William Robinson, who I mentioned, from Little Britain Street, and John William Scott from Fitzroy Avenue. So they're just like, they're the Dublin people who were killed on Bloody Sunday. And then you had others like Tom Ryan from Wexford. He lived on Viking Road in Stoneybatter. You had Tom Hogan, who was 19. He was a mechanic from Limerick, and he lived in Dolphin's Barn. Daniel Carroll, he wasn't even meant to go to the match. He decided at the last minute, and he had actually got out of the ground, and he got shot in the leg, and he died on the Tuesday. He lived on James Street East, which is right in the middle, kind of around Bagot Street. You had James Tehan, who owned a pub in Green Street, which is really close to Little Britain Street. So you have all these Dublin connections that you can look at as well. And I think this is the most interesting thing about Bloody Sunday, and it's the thing that's really changed it for us, that we can look at the people now. Like, sometimes history can be a bit boring. Like, you can kind of hear just, you know, such and such a thing happened on this date, and this 14 people died, and it happened 100 years ago, and how does it mean anything to us? But I was 10 years of age when I went to my very first match in Croke Park, and I know exactly how Jerome O'Leary would have felt going to that match. I was 11 when I went to my first All-Ireland final. Although I'm sure all you guys with Dublin been so many All-Ireland finals, you've been in loads of finals before you were 11. But I was 11 when I went to my first All-Ireland final, so I know exactly how William Robinson felt going to it. And I'm from Cork. Cork won the double All-Ireland hurling and football titles when I was 14, which is the same age as John William Scott. So all you have to do is imagine how excited you are if you're going to a GA match or a soccer match or a rugby game or something that you really love. That's exactly how those guys would have felt going to Croke Park. And that's how they're the same as us and we're the same as them. We're all connected, even though it's 100 years away. So very best of luck with your projects. I hope you enjoy finding out more about these guys, and I hope that you learn loads, and even maybe if you're in the locality of some of these people, or you know the GA clubs I'm talking about, maybe you might even learn a little bit more about the area you live in, and what would have happened back then, and what kind of place it was to live. I'm sure you all know already, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's some great places to get information on this. GAA.ie/Bloody Sunday has tons now on the victims and on what happened on Bloody Sunday. I did a podcast called the Bloodied Field podcast. It's 8 parts, and I hope it's pretty easy to listen to, but that's there as well, wherever you can find podcasts on Spotify or wherever, you'll find them there anyway. And the last one, if you want to buy the Bloodied Field book, it's a bit long, but it might be a good one for a Christmas present or something like that. And you can pick out the best of it if it's helpful for your project. But look, best of luck with it. And I can tell you, thanks so much for all the work you guys are doing in sharing the story and learning about it, because I know from talking to the relatives of the victims that they really appreciate it, that people are remembering their relatives and telling the story through them in a different way, and learning all about Bloody Sunday in this way through people, which is the most important thing. It's the most interesting way, I think, to learn about these things is to think of them as stories. So thanks so much, and the very best of luck with everything.
Michael, thank you so much for that fantastic insight. I really love the way you tied geography and history together with the person. Like, I think learning about the victims, their clubs, the schools they came from. I know Cumann and mBunscol's founder school was St. Pat's Boys National School in Drumcondra.
That's right, yeah. That was John William Scott. Yeah, and I forgot as well, the other one that we know actually is William Robinson went to school on Church Street in St. Michan's School. I don't think it's there anymore, but that's where he went to school. We don't know about Jerome O'Leary, but just for the sake of that's where William Robinson went to school, was in St. Michan's, the old church that's there now.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's great to be able to tie the connections to the places and the clubs and the schools. So thank you so much for your time this evening. On behalf of Cumann and mBunscol, a huge heartfelt thank you for all the work you've put in, your time, your effort, and you just have a way of storytelling that brings it alive and brings it to today. So thank you so much. I know the children are going to produce excellent projects, and we'll have to send some your way to have a look at.
Oh, I'd love to see them. I'd love to see them.
Yeah, we're very excited. We've had lots of interest so far. And I just remind the children that the closing date is the 15th of December, and all entries can be sent to pro@cnnb.ie, and all our details can be found on Twitter. And at the end of this talk, I will just share the screenshot of our flyer. So Michael, again, thank you so much for that interesting chat. I know the kids will have got lots from it. I know I certainly did. And it really brought history back to life. So I think it was a lovely way to commemorate the 100 years of Bloody Sunday. Thank you so much,
Thank,
Elizabeth.
thanks a million, guys, and best of luck again. Thanks, Leona. Thanks very much.
Slán agus fannach agus gan éirí libh. Slán.
Slán.